Welcome, nighttime traveler, to Sleepy Bedtime Stories, your haven of stories and tales to help you sleep. This is the place where traditional tales come to life and accompany you on your journey to rest. But first, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know if you're joining me from your bed, from a cozy sofa, or perhaps from some corner of the world where you can still feel the spirit of ancient tales. Please leave me a comment. Every message from you is like a fragment of a precious amphora. If you'd like to support this space of peace and relaxation, subscribe and share the channel so that more people can find their refuge here. And now, take a slow, deep breath, because tonight we're going to dive into another thrilling story.
History of the Second World War. Chapter 1. The morning mist slowly lifts over the fields of Poland as the sun on 1 September 1939 begins to illuminate a world that is about to change forever. On the border between Germany and Poland, more than 1.5 million German soldiers await the signal. They have been camped in secret for days, their tanks hidden beneath camouflage netting, their aircraft lined up at newly built airfields. The tension is palpable in the cool dawn air. The men smoke in silence. They check their weapons. They write letters that may never reach their destinations. They do not know that they are about to launch the most destructive conflict humanity has ever known. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte, near Danzig. The roar of the guns shatters the silence of dawn. It is the first shot of the Second World War. Minutes later, along the entire border, German artillery begins its deadly symphony. 1,500 Luftwaffe aircraft take off into the still dark sky, heading to bomb cities, airfields, and concentrations of Polish troops. The Stukas, those dive bombers with their wailing sirens designed to terrify, plummet from the sky like metallic birds of prey. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, has just been born. It is a completely new military doctrine that combines aviation, tanks, and motorized infantry in a coordination never seen before. The Germa N-panzers cut through the Polish defenses like hot knives cutting through butter. They do not advance in solid lines as in the First World War, but in rapid spearheads that penetrate deep, encircling enemy forces, cutting their lines of communication, sowing chaos and confusion. Poland fights with desperate bravery. Its soldiers, many of them still mounted on horses, launch themselves in suicidal charges against the German tanks. The image of the Polish cavalry attacking panzers will become Nazi propaganda, although the reality is more complex. The Poles fought with everything they had, knowing they were doomed from the start. Warsaw is bombed mercilessly. Buildings burst into flames. Civilians run seeking refuge that does not exist. The streets are filled with rubble and the screams of the wounded. But Poland is not facing Germany alone. On 17 September, barely 2 weeks after the German invasion, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. This is the consequence of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the secret agreement signed just days before the outbreak of war between Hitler and Stalin, two dictators who publicly despised one another, but who privately divided up Eastern Europe like cakes at a macabre banquet. The Polish army, already exhausted from fighting the Germans in the west, must now face the Red Army in the east. It is the end. On 27 September, Warsaw surrenders after a brutal siege that has left the city in ruins. Poland ceases to exist as an independent nation, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. But this is not the end, but the beginning. Because England and France, bound to Poland by mutual defense treaties, have declared war on Germany on 3 September. However, they do nothing. They remain passive behind the Maginot Line, that chain of French fortifications on the border with Germany, which is supposed to be impenetrable. They wait. They watch. This period will become known as the Phony War. Months of declarations of war without any real battles on the Western Front. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, a less visible but equally devastating tragedy begins. Soviet troops occupying eastern Poland begin mass arrests. Polish officers, intellectuals, teachers, priests, anyone who might represent leadership for a future resistance is taken to Soviet prisons. In the spring of 1940, in the Katyn forest near Smolensk, the Soviet NKVD will execute more than 22,000 Poles with a shot to the back of the head. Their bodies will be buried in mass graves that will remain secret for years, a war crime that Stalin will deny until his death. The winter of 1939 brings another war. Finland, that small Nordic nation of barely 3 million inhabitants, refuses to cede the territories demanded by Stalin. On 30 November, the Red Army invades Finland with overwhelming force, 45 divisions, thousands of tanks, a 3-to-1 numerical superiority. Stalin expects a swift victory, a repeat of Poland. But the Finns have other ideas. In the frozen forests of Karelia, where temperatures drop to 40 degrees below zero, the Finns wage a brilliant guerrilla war. Equipped with skis and dressed entirely in white to blend into the snow, they attack Soviet columns and vanish like ghosts into the forest. Is greater than a Finnish sniper named Simo Heiha, using only a rifle with iron sights and no telescopic sight, kills more than 500 Soviet soldiers in 100 days. The Russians call him the White Death. Soviet divisions, prepared for conventional warfare, are massacred in ambushes where the Finns destroy entire convoys and leave the frozen bodies as warnings. But Finnish heroism cannot indefinitely compensate for the numerical disparity. By March 1940, exhausted and without significant international support, the Finns accept an armistice. They cede the territories Stalin had originally demanded, but have inflicted such losses on the Red Army that Hitler takes note. Stalin has shown weakness. The Soviet giant can be defeated. This perception will fatally influence Hitler's future decisions. Whilst the world watches the drama in the East, Hitler plans his next move. On 9 April 1940, without a prior declaration of war, Germany simultaneously invades Denmark and Norway. Denmark, completely defenseless, surrenders within 6 hours, the shortest resistance of the entire war. Norway fights back, but German coordination between paratroopers, naval infantry, and the Luftwaffe is flawless. Oslo falls within hours. British and French troops attempt to assist by landing at Narvik in northern Norway. But the campaign is a disaster in terms of coordination. By June, Norway has fallen completely. The world's attention then turns westwards. On 10 May 1940, before dawn, German forces simultaneously invade Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. It is the moment France and England have been waiting for, but not in the way they had anticipated. The French had based their entire strategy on the Maginot Line and on the expectation that Germany would repeat the plan from the First World War by attacking across Belgium in open country. They had moved their best troops to Belgium to meet the Germans there. But the Germans have other plans. Whilst a group of armies attacks Belgium, just as the Allies had expected, the main blow comes from where no one expects it, through the Ardennes, that region of dense forests and mountainous terrain which the French considered impassable for tanks. General Heinz Guderian leads a concentration of panzer divisions that crosses the Ardennes in 3 days. emerges at Sedan and crosses the river Meuse before the French can react. It is the perfect pincer movement. Guderian's panzers race towards the English Channel, cutting off the supply lines of the French and British forces in Belgium. Within a week, they have reached the coast. 300,000 British and French soldiers are trapped in a pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The disaster is total. Defeat seems inevitable. But then, what the British would call the miracle of Dunkirk occurs. Hitler, inexplicably, orders his panzers to halt at the gates of Dunkirk. The reasons will be debated for decades. Some say he wanted to preserve his tanks for the final battle against France. Others that he hoped to negotiate peace with England. Others that it was simply a miscalculation. Whatever the reason, that 3-day pause allows the British to organize Operation Dynamo. Between 26 May and 4 June, a makeshift fleet of over 800 vessels crossed the English Channel to Dunkirk. Royal Navy destroyers, fishing boats, private yachts, ferries, any vessel that could float and carry men. Under constant bombardment from the Luftwaffe and German artillery fire, these ships evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. The men waited in orderly lines on the beach, wading out into the sea up to their necks in water, boarding the dinghies that will take them to larger ships. RAF Spitfires fight desperate dogfights over the beaches, keeping the German bombers at bay long enough for the evacuation to continue. It is a defeat turned into salvation. The British lose all their heavy equipment, all their tanks, all their artillery. But they save the army, the trained men who will form the core of the forces that will eventually return to Europe. Churchill, the new British Prime Minister who has just taken office, addresses Parliament with words that will define British resistance. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the Fai Elds. We shall never surrender. Meanwhile, France is crumbling. The Germans turn south, towards Paris. On 14 June, German troops march down the Champs-Élysées. Paris, the city of light, has fallen without a fight. The French government has fled. The elderly Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of the First World War, takes power and calls for an armistice. On 22 June, in the very same railway carriage where Germany signed its surrender in 1918, France signs its capitulation. Hitler performs a little victory dance. The humiliation of Versailles has been avenged. France is divided. the north and the Atlantic coast under direct German occupation, the south formerly independent under Peyton's Vichy government, but in reality a puppet state. Only a relatively unknown brigadier general named Charles de Gaulle escapes to London and proclaims over the radio that France has lost a battle but not the war, that the resistance must continue. Few listened to him at that moment. England is left alone. Across the English Channel, just 35 kilometers away, the victorious German divisions camp on the French beaches, gazing towards the white cliffs of Dover. Hitler hopes that England will accept reality, that it will negotiate a peace allowing it to retain its empire in exchange for recognizing German dominance over continental Europe. But Churchill, that British bulldog with his ever-present cigar and his gift for inspiring phrases, rejects any negotiation. England will fight alone if necessary. Hitler orders preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. But first, the Luftwaffe must gain air supremacy. The Battle of Britain begins. In July 1940, waves of German bombers escorted by Messerschmitt fighters cross the Channel, attacking RAF airfields, radar installations, ports. The aim is to destroy the RAF on the ground or in the air, leaving England defenseless for an amphibious invasion. RAF pilots, many of them barely in their 20s, fight aerial battles over the green fields of Kent and Sussex. Spitfires and Hurricanes against Messerschmitts and Heinkels. British pilots fly 4, 5, 6 sorties a day, sleeping in their cockpits between air raid alerts, exhausted beyond the limits of normal human endurance. They fall from the sky in flames. They are replaced by ever younger pilots with ever less training. The RAF is bleeding, but holding out. Then Hitler makes a crucial mistake. Frustrated that the RAF has not been destroyed, he orders a change of target. Instead of attacking military airfields, the Luftwaffe is to bomb cities. London, Birmingham, Coventry. On 7 September, the Blitz begins. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers attack London every night. Air raid sirens wail at dusk. Londoners descend into the underground shelters, sleeping on the platforms whilst the city burns above. Entire neighborhoods vanish in stow, RMs of fire. 30,000 civilians will die in the Blitz. But London does not surrender. And whilst cities are being bombed, the Germans give the RAF time to recover. Airfields are repaired. Pilots rest. New aircraft roll out of the factories. By October, it is clear that the Luftwaffe cannot gain air supremacy. Hitler postpones Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. England has won its first victory, defending its home island against the military machine that conquered Europe in weeks. But whilst England holds out, other battlefields open up. In September 1940, Italy, which has watched the German victories with envy and opportunism, invades Egypt from its colony of Libya. The Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, an ally of Hitler, wants his share of the glory. His troops advance 60 kilometers into Egyptian territory and halt, establishing fortified camps in the desert. The British, despite fighting for their survival at home, launched a counter-offensive in December with a much smaller but better led force. Operation Compass, under the command of General Wavell, routed the Italian army. In 2 months, the British advanced 800 kilometers, took 130,000 Italian prisoners, and destroyed the entire invading army. Mussolini, humiliated, was forced to ask Hitler for help. Hitler sends the Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel, a daring general who had made a name for himself in France, is less than number, Touhache is greater than Rommel, arrives in Libya in February 1941 with orders simply to hold his position. Instead, he ignores his orders and attacks immediately, recapturing in 2 weeks all the territory the Italians had lost in 2 months. Thus begins the Desert War, that back-and-forth campaign across North Africa which will last 2 years, with Rommel and the British trading victories and defeats in the Sea of Sand. But North Africa is a secondary theatre compared to what is yet to come. In the Balkans, Mussolini makes another disastrous mistake. In October 1940, he invades Greece from Albania without consulting Hitler. He expects an easy victory. Instead, the Greeks, fighting in their native mountains, rout the Italians, drive them back into Albania, and threaten to expel Italy entirely from the Balkans. Hitler, furious with his incompetent ally, is forced to intervene. In April 1941, Germany invades Yugoslavia and Greece simultaneously. Yugoslavia surrenders within 11 days. Greece, despite receiving British aid, falls within 3 weeks. German paratroopers carry out the first large-scale airborne invasion in history, capturing Crete in a bloody battle where they suffer such heavy losses that Hitler will never again use paratroopers in large-scale assault operations. But these Balkan campaigns, however successful they may be, have an unforeseen consequence. They delay the operation most important in Hitler's mind. The invasion of the Soviet Union, originally planned for May, must be postponed until June to allow the divisions involved in the Balkans to regroup. That 5-week delay would prove fatal. On 22 June 1941, exactly 1 year after the surrender of France, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This was Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. Is greater than 150 German divisions, supported by Romanian, Finnish, Hungarian, and Italian. Allies, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft. The objective: to destroy the Soviet Union in a 4-month campaign before winter sets in. The surprise is total despite the many warnings Stalin received and ignored. The Soviet dictator was so convinced that Hitler would not be so foolish as to open a second front while still fighting Britain that he interpreted all the signs of the impending invasion as British provocations. When German bombers attack Soviet airfields at dawn, they destroy 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground on the first day. Panzer columns penetrate Soviet defenses with chilling ease. The Red Army, purged of most of its competent officers by Stalin's paranoia in the 1930s, fights with desperate bravery but without effective coordination. Entire divisions are surrounded and captured. In Minsk, 300,000 Soviet soldiers surrender. In Smolensk, another 300,000. In Kiev, the largest encirclement battle in history traps 650,000 Soviet soldiers. The Germans advance 50 kilometers a day. They seem unstoppable. The inhabitants of the occupied zones quickly realize that this is not a conventional war of territorial conquest. Behind the front lines, special units known as Einsatzgruppen follow the combat troops with a specific mission to exterminate Jews. Political commissars, intellectuals, anyone the Nazis consider subhuman or dangerous. At Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, more than 33,000 Jews are murdered in 2 days, shot and thrown into mass graves. It is the Holocaust by bullets, the initial phase of the genocide that will eventually kill 6 million European Jews. But as the Germans advance towards Moscow, the weather begins to change. Autumn rains turn the unpaved Russian roads into rivers of mud. The tanks get bogged down. Supplies cannot reach the front. And the Germans discover that they have massively underestimated the Soviet capacity for mobilization. Stalin relocates entire factories from the west to the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers. He recruits millions of new soldiers. He brings in Siberian divisions from the east. Fresh troops acclimatized to the extreme cold. In December, when temperatures drop to 35 degrees below zero, the Germans can see the Kremlin towers through binoculars from their forward positions. They are 30 kilometers from Moscow, but they cannot advance any further. Their soldiers are freezing, without proper winter uniforms, because no one planned for a winter campaign. The tanks won't start because the oil freezes. The wounded are dying because medical supplies cannot reach them through the mud and snow. On 5 December, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launches a massive counterattack with 100 fresh divisions. The Germans, exhausted and frozen, are pushed back 100 kilometers. It is the Wehrmacht's first major defeat on land. The Blitzkrieg is over. Now begins a war of attrition that Germany cannot win. Whilst the Red Army saves Moscow, on the other side of the world, an event occurs that will transform the European conflict into a truly global war. On 7 December 1941, a quiet Sunday in Hawaii, hundreds of Japanese aircraft appear over Pearl Harbor. It is 7:55 a.m. American sailors are having breakfast, sleeping, writing letters home. The air raid sirens sound too late. Japanese torpedo bombers fly so low over the water that their pilots can see the horrified faces of the sailors on deck. Dive bombers plunge from the sky like hawks. In a 2-hour coordinated attack, they sink or severely damage 18 warships, including 8 battleships. They destroy 188 aircraft on the ground. They kill 2,400 Americans. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, has staked everything on a knockout blow that will knock the United States out of the war before it begins. But he makes 2 crucial mistakes. The American aircraft carriers, the ships that will really matter in the Pacific War, are not in Pearl Harbor that day. And he underestimates American resolve. The following day, President Franklin Roosevelt addresses Congress and declares 7 December a date that will live in infamy. The United States declares war on Japan. 3 days later, Hitler, in an act of incredible strategic stupidity, declares war on the United States. even though he was under no obligation to do so under his alliance with Japan. He now faces not only the Soviet Union and the British Empire, but also the American industrial giant. He has sealed his own defeat, although it will take another 3 years to materialize. The year 1942 brings spectacular Japanese victories in the Pacific. In a matter of months, Japan conquers the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, Indonesia, New Guinea. The British Empire suffers its worst surrender in history when Singapore falls in February, with 80,000 British soldiers marching into captivity. The Japanese advance towards India in the west and towards Australia in the south. They seem invincible. But in June, on a small island called Midway in the middle of the Pacific, the tide turns. The US Navy, having cracked the Japanese codes, lays a perfect ambush for the approaching Japanese aircraft carrier fleet. In a chaotic 3-day air battle, the Americans sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of the Imperial Navy. Japan will never recover from this loss. The initiative in the Pacific passes to the United States. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Desert War continues its deadly dance. Rommel launches his most successful offensive, driving the British back into Egypt, capturing Tobruk, and threatening Cairo and the Suez Canal. But in October, at El Alamein, a new British commander named Bernard Montgomery halts Rommel in a battle lasting 12 days. The British finally have enough tanks, enough aircraft, enough men. Rommel, lacking adequate supplies because British submarines and aircraft were sinking his convoys in the Mediterranean, was forced to retreat. He would never advance again. Churchill would later say that before El Alamein we never had a victor. Why? And after El Alamein we never had a defeat. In November, American and British troops land in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. It is the first large-scale American land engagement against Germany. The inexperienced American troops suffer initial setbacks, particularly at Kasserine Pass, where Rommel teaches them a brutal lesson. But they learn quickly. By May 1943, trapped between Montgomery advancing from the east and the Americans from the west, the Afrika Korps surrenders in Tunisia. 250,000 Axis soldiers march into captivity. North Africa has been cleared. But it is in Russia that the most important battle of the entire war is fought. In Stalingrad, an industrial city on the banks of the Volga named after the Soviet dictator, the most brutal battle in human history unfolds. Hitler, obsessed with capturing the city for its symbolic value, orders the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus to take Stalingrad at any cost. For 5 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, Germans and Soviets fought for every building, every floor, every room. Factories became fortresses. Soldiers kill each other from a few meters away. A building can change hands 15 times in a single day. Snipers lurk in the ruins. Soldiers live in basements flooded with freezing water. The wounded die because there is no way to evacuate them. The dead are left where they fall because no one has time to bury them. In November, as the urban battle rages on, the Soviets launch Operation Uranus, a pincer movement that completely encircles the entire Sixth Army. 300,000 German soldiers are trapped in a pocket around Stalingrad. Hitler orders them to hold out, promising that the Luftwaffe will supply them by air. But the Luftwaffe cannot deliver even a fraction of the necessary supplies. The German soldiers starve to death, frozen in underground bunkers. On 2 February 1943, Paulus surrenders with the 90,000 survivors of his army. Of these, only 6,000 will return alive from Soviet prisoner of war camps. Stalingrad is the turning point of the war in the East. From this point on, it is the Red Army that will advance and the Wehrmacht that will retreat. July 1943 brings the last major German offensive in the East, the Battle of Kursk. Hitler concentrates everything he has, 3,000 tanks, including the new Tigers and Panthers, 2,000 aircraft. The aim is to eliminate a Soviet salient around Kursk. But the Soviets, warned by spies, have prepared deep defenses, minefields stretching for kilometers, anti-tank trenches, concealed artillery, thousands of their own tanks waiting in reserve. The battle that follows is the greatest tank confrontation in history. Near Prokhorovka, more than 1,500 tanks clash on a field that becomes a steel slaughterhouse. The tanks collide with one another, fire at point-blank range, explode in balls of fire. In the end, the Germans lose. They have lost their last chance to regain the initiative in the East. From here on, the Red Army will advance relentlessly westwards, towards Berlin. Whilst Russia bleeds, the Western Allies finally open a second front in Europe. In July 1943, American and British troops invade Sicily. The the conquest of the island takes just 38 days. Mussolini, discredited by the defeats, is arrested on the orders of the King of Italy. A new Italian government negotiates secretly with the Allies. On 8 September, Italy surrenders, but the Germans respond swiftly. They occupy all of Italy north of Naples. They rescue Mussolini and install him as the leader of a puppet state. When the Allies land at Salerno in September to invade mainland Italy, the Germans are waiting for them with their defenses in place. The Italian campaign becomes a slow and bloody struggle up the peninsula, mountain by mountain, river by river. At Monte Cassino, the Allies are held up for 4 months against German positions in a medieval abbey. Victory in Italy will be slow and costly. In the Pacific, the Americans have begun their island-hopping campaign, capturing strategic Japanese bases whilst bypassing others, leaving them isolated and worthless. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, Saipan. Every battle is hell. The Japanese do not surrender. They prefer to die in suicidal banzai charges rather than give themselves up. The US Marines learn to show no quarter because none is asked for. On Saipan, when it becomes clear that the battle is lost, thousands of Japanese civilians commit suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs rather than surrender to the Americans. Mothers throw their babies into the ocean and then jump themselves. Japanese fanaticism means that every island conquered costs thousands of American lives, and there are still hundreds of islands between US forces and Japan. On 6 June 1944 is less than Hashone number, is greater than before dawn. 5,000 ships cross the English Channel towards the beaches of Normandy. It is D-Day, the largest seaborne invasion in history. 156,000 Allied soldiers, mainly Americans, British and Canadians, storm 5 beaches with code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. At Omaha Beach, the invasion nearly fails. The Germans hold fortified positions on the cliffs overlooking the beach. Machine guns sweep the sand. Soldiers leap from their landing craft straight into the water, drowning under the weight of their kit or mowed down by gunfire. Bodies float in the blood-red waves. The wounded crawl, seeking shelter behind the beach obstacles. For a moment, it seems the invasion will be driven back into the sea. But small groups of men, led by sergeants and lieutenants whose names will never be famous, begin to advance. They cut through the barbed wire, destroy the bunkers with explosive charges, and scale the cliffs under fire. By the end of the day, the 5 beaches are secured. The beachheads are precarious. The Germans counterattack fiercely, but the Allies are in France to stay. The Battle of Normandy lasts 2 months. The Allies are trapped in the bocage, that labyrinth of tall hedgerows and small fields where every field is a fortress. The Germans defend every meter, but the Allies have absolute air superiority. Any German movement during the day is attacked by fighter bombers. German reinforcements arrive in tatters. The panzer divisions that could have pushed the invasion back to the sea had they arrived on D-Day arrive in fragments after weeks of travel under constant bombardment. By the end of July, the Americans finally achieve a breakthrough in Operation Cobra. Patton's tanks surge across open country. The Germans attempt a desperate counterattack at Mortain, but are crushed by Allied air power. By August, the German army in Normandy is trapped in a pocket around Falaise. 50,000 German soldiers are captured, 10,000 killed. It is a disaster comparable to Stalingrad. Paris is liberated on 25 August. General de Gaulle, who has waited 4 years in exile, marches down the Champs-Élysées before jubilant crowds. But the war is not over. The Germans retreat towards the German border, establishing new defensive lines. In September, an Allied airborne operation called Market Garden attempts to capture bridges in the Netherlands and open a direct route into Germany. It fails disastrously at Arnhem, where a British airborne division is destroyed. In December, Hitler launches his last desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the very place where he achieved victory in 1940. He concentrates his last reserves, including elite SS Panzer divisions, for a surprise attack aimed at splitting the Allied forces and capturing Antwerp. On 16 December, amid a snowstorm that keeps Allied aircraft grounded, the Germans attack. The Battle of the Bulge created the bulge in the Allied lines that gave it its name in English. Battle of the Bulge. The Germans advance 50 kilometers. They encircle the town of Bastogne, where the US 101st Airborne Division holds out under siege. When the Germans demand surrender, General McAuliffe replies with a single word: nuts. Bastogne holds out. By January 1945, the weather improves. Allied aircraft are flying again. American reinforcements arrive. The German offensive comes to a halt. then retreats. Hitler has squandered his last reserves in a desperate gamble that has failed. Now Germany is completely on the defensive on both fronts. In the east, the Red Army has advanced through Poland. On 27 January, Soviet troops liberate Auschwitz, the extermination camp in Poland where more than 1 million people, mainly Jews, have been murdered in gas chambers. Soviet soldiers discover the crematoria, the mountains of shoes and human hair, the emaciated survivors who barely look human. The horror of the Holocaust, hitherto scarcely believed even when reported, becomes undeniable. The Soviets advance relentlessly towards Berlin. They cross the river Oder in January, establishing bridgeheads just 60 kilometers from the German capital. But they pause, consolidating, gathering strength for the final assault. Meanwhile, the Western Allies cross the Rhine in March. The campaign in Germany becomes a race between the Soviets and the Western Allies to see who will reach Berlin first. Hitler, holed up in his bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin, has lost touch with reality. He moves phantom divisions on maps, ordering counterattacks by armies that no longer exist. He blames everyone but himself for the impending defeat. He orders the destruction of all German infrastructure, a scorched earth policy that would condemn Germany to starvation. His Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, secretly ignores these suicidal orders. On 16 April, the Red Army launched its final offensive against Berlin. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. The initial artillery barrage was so intense that it shook buildings kilometers away. The Germans defend Berlin with everything they have: regular soldiers, fanatical SS, barely trained elderly men from the Volkssturm, children from the Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts. The battle for Berlin is urban, brutal, almost medieval in its intimacy. Soldiers fight room by room. Snipers lie in wait in the ruins. Soviet tanks are ambushed in narrow streets. Cellars become fortresses. The underground is flooded to prevent Soviet troop movements, drowning thousands of civilian refugees. The city is ablaze. The sky is permanently darkened by smoke. On 30 April, with the Soviets just blocks away from the bunker, Adolf Hitler commits suicide by shooting himself. Eva Braun, his longtime lover, whom he had married just hours earlier, takes cyanide. Their bodies are burned in the Chancellery Garden in a hasty attempt to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Admiral Dönitz assumes leadership of what remains of Germany. On 2 May, the Berlin garrison surrenders. On 7 May, in Reims, France, German General Alfred Jodl signs the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The war in Europe is over. 8 May is declared Victory in Europe Day. Celebrations erupt in London, Paris, New York. But in the devastated cities of Eastern Europe, in the liberated concentration camps, in the ruins of Berlin, there is less celebration and more exhausted bewilderment. But the World War is not over. Japan is still fighting. In the Pacific, the Americans captured Iwo Jima in February after a month-long battle that cost 26,000 American casualties for an island of barely 20 square kilometers. In Okinawa, from April to June, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War kills 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese, including thousands of civilians who commit suicide rather than surrender. US military planners estimate that an invasion of the main Japanese islands will cost 1 million Allied casualties and tens of millions of Japanese lives. The Japanese fanaticism, demonstrated in every battle, suggests they will fight to the last man, woman, and child. But there is an alternative. A secret project called Manhattan has produced a new weapon of unimaginable power. On 6 August 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flies over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it drops a single bomb. 600 meters above the city, the atomic bomb detonates with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. A fireball reached temperatures of 1 million degrees. Everything within a kilometer of the epicenter was instantly vaporized. A shockwave flattened buildings within a 3-kilometer radius. 70,000 people died instantly. Another 70,000 would die in the following months from burns and radiation. Japan does not respond. On 9 August, a second atomic bomb destroys Nagasaki. 40,000 more die immediately. That very night, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and invades Manchuria, crushing the Japanese army there within days. Emperor Hirohito, speaking publicly for the first time in Japanese history, announces Japan's surrender on the radio, citing the terrible new bomb that has caused such suffering. On 2 September 1945, on the deck of the battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives signed the instrument of surrender. The Second World War has officially ended. It lasted 6 years and 1 day. It has killed between 70 and 85 million people, most of them civilians. It has destroyed entire cities. It has displaced tens of millions of refugees. It has revealed the depths of human evil in extermination camps and has also demonstrated the human capacity for sacrifice and heroism. Europe lies in ruins. Cities such as Warsaw, Dresden, Rotterdam, Stalingrad have been wiped off the map. Berlin is a lunar landscape of rubble where people live in cellars. Famine looms over the continent. Millions of soldiers remain in prison camps. Millions more refugees roam the roads in search of homes that no longer exist. The Nuremberg trials will begin in November, putting surviving Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity. A new egal concept created specifically to address the enormity of the Holocaust. 12 will be sentenced to death. But no trial can truly make amends for 6 million Jews gassed, shot, or worked to death. No sentence can resurrect the destroyed cities or heal the trauma of generations. The world emerging from the war is fundamentally different from the one that entered it. Europe, which dominated the world for centuries, is exhausted and impoverished. Global power has shifted to 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Already at Yalta, in February 1945, when Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin met to plan the post-war world, the seeds of the Cold War were sown. Eastern Europe falls under Soviet control. Germany is divided. A new rivalry begins that will last 4 decades. The war has accelerated technological developments at an unprecedented pace. German V-2 rockets are the forerunners of ballistic missiles and space rockets. Jet aircraft, developed by both sides at the end of the war, will revolutionize aviation. The atomic bomb ushers in the nuclear age. Computers, developed to break codes and calculate artillery trajectories, would transform civilization. But above all, the Second World War is a reminder of the terrible cost of totalitarian ideology, of extreme nationalism, of racial hatred, of demagoguery. Hitler promised Germany the restoration of its greatness after the humiliation of Versailles. He delivered ruins and eternal Heim. Mussolini promised to restore the Roman Empire. He delivered defeat and occupation. The Japanese militarists promised the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They delivered 2 cities destroyed by atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. The lessons seem obvious. That total war between great powers with modern weapons is catastrophic. That industrial genocide is possible and must be prevented at all costs. That democracies must remain vigilant against totalitarianism. But the lessons of history are easy to forget when the generations who lived through them disappear. In the cemeteries dotted across Europe, from Normandy to Stalingrad, from North Africa to Italy, millions of soldiers lie at rest. Every white cross, every Star of David represents a life cut short, a family torn apart, a future never lived. The American soldier who died on Omaha Beach never met his grandchildren. The British pilot shot down over the Channel never wrote the novel he had planned. The Soviet soldier who froze to death in Stalingrad never saw his village again. And the civilians, the Jewish children who died in Auschwitz, never grew up. The families in London crushed in the Blitz never saw the end of the war. The German civilians incinerated in Dresden experienced terror equal to that which their government had inflicted on others. Suffering made no distinction between perpetrators and innocent victims in its final stages. The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human story, but it was also, in the final analysis, avoidable. It was not an inevitable natural disaster, but the result of human decisions. Hitler's decision to seek revenge and Lebensraum. The decision of Western appeasers to yield to unreasonable demands. Stalin's decision to rely on a pact with the devil. Japan's decision to seek empire through conquest. When silence finally fell upon the battlefields in September 1945, the world began the long process of counting its dead, rebuilding what had been destroyed, and trying to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The United Nations was founded in the hope that diplomacy might prevent future conflicts. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted as a reminder of what happens when such rights are trampled upon. But as the sun sets on this story, as the voices of the narrators fade away, it is worth remembering that peace is not the natural state of humanity, but an achievement that requires constant vigilance. The men and women who fought and died in the Second World War bequeathed to us a world free from fascist tyranny. It is up to each generation to preserve that legacy, to remember the horrors that hatred can unleash, and to choose, every day, peace over war, understanding over prejudice, cooperation over conflict. In the rebuilt cities, in the war memorials, in the stories told by grandparents to grandchildren, The memory of the war endures, and it must endure, not to glorify the conflict, but to remind us of its cost. Because only by remembering the worst we were capable of doing can we hope to be better in the future. The Second World War ended decades ago, but its lessons remain eternal as long as humanity chooses to remember them. History of the Second World War. Chapter 2. Snow falls gently on the forest of Compiègne in France, covering the scars on the earth where, barely 2 decades earlier, the First World War had ended. It is the 22nd of June, 1940, and in the very same railway carriage where Germany signed its humiliating surrender in 1918, Adolf Hitler watches as French representatives sit down to sign France's capitulation. Hitler has specifically ordered that the carriage be removed from the museum where it was on display and placed in the exact same spot where it stood in 1918. It is a perfectly calculated act of symbolic revenge. After the signing, Hitler will order the carriage to be taken to Berlin as a trophy, that the French monument be destroyed, that every trace of Germany's previous humiliation be erased. History, in Hitler's mind, is being rewritten. But whilst France falls and Hitler savors his victory, there are aspects of this war unfolding in the shadows, far from the obvious battlefields. The intelligence war, the economic war, the technological war are parallel conflicts as significant as any military campaign. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside, British mathematicians are working feverishly to crack the German codes. Alan Turing, an eccentric mathematical genius, leads the team building electromechanical machines called bombs to break the Enigma code, which the Germans consider unbreakable. The work at Bletchley Park is tedious, frustrating, carried out in complete secrecy by people whose names will not be publicly known for decades. But its success is crucial. When they finally crack Enigma in 1941, the Allies are able to read German communications almost in real time. Churchill receives intelligence reports, known as Ultra, which give him an unprecedented insight into enemy intentions and movements. This knowledge will save countless lives, but must be used with extreme caution. If the Germans suspect that Enigma has been compromised, they will change their codes. That is why the Allies must sometimes allow attacks to happen that they could prevent, in order to protect the source of their intelligence. In November 1940, the British learn from Ultra that the Luftwaffe is planning a massive bombing raid on Coventry. Churchill faces an impossible decision. He could strengthen the defenses, evacuate civilians, but that would alert the Germans that their codes have been compromised. He chooses to sacrifice Coventry. The city is bombed to ruins. 568 civilians die. The medieval cathedral is destroyed. But Enigma remains secret. It is the kind of brutal decision that defines this war, where the deaths of hundreds must be accepted to potentially save thousands. At the same time, on the oceans, a battle is being fought that will determine the outcome of the war as much as any land-based confrontation. The Battle of the Atlantic is a years-long struggle between German U-boats and Allied convoys carrying vital supplies from America to England. The German submarines, hunting in wolf packs under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz, sink millions of tons of cargo. In the early years of the war, the U-boats have the upper hand. They can submerge during the day and attack convoys at night on the surface, where they are almost impossible to detect. Allied merchant seamen face a particular horror. When a torpedo strikes, they have minutes to abandon ship before it sinks. In the North Atlantic, the waters are so cold that a man can survive for only minutes before dying of hypothermia. Lifeboats drift for days awaiting rescue that sometimes never comes. Survivors tell tales of comrades who simply fall asleep and never wake up, frozen to death in silence. More than 30,000 Allied merchant seamen will die in the Battle of the Atlantic, a statistic often overlooked in military casualty figures. But the tide is gradually turning. The British develop radar capable of detecting submarines on the surface. Long-range bombers can patrol the mid-Atlantic, closing off the airspace that was once a refuge for U-boats. More importantly, the decryption of German naval codes allows the Allies to reroute convoys around the wolf packs. By 1943, the Germans are losing submarines faster than they can build them. Dönitz will eventually withdraw the U-boats from the North Atlantic. England will not be strangled by blockade. Allied victory becomes possible. On the Eastern Front, the scale of the conflict defies comprehension. Whilst the Western Front in the First World War stretched 700 kilometers, the Eastern Front in this war stretches 3,000 kilometers from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The battles involve millions of men. The casualty figures are so vast they become abstract. 300,000 here, 500,000 there. Behind these statistics lie individual tragedies multiplied to infinity. The siege of Leningrad exemplifies this suffering. From September 1941 to January 1944, 872 days. German forces completely encircle the city. 2.5 million people were trapped inside. Hitler had ordered that Leningrad be wiped off the map, that its inhabitants should starve to death. There would be no urban combat, only a siege until everyone was dead. During the first winter of the siege, rations dropped to 125 grams of bread per day. It is a mixture of sawdust, cellulose, and a little flour. People eat glue made from boiled bones, shoe leather, anything that can provide calories. Mortality rates reach medieval levels. Corpses pile up in the streets because no one has the strength to bury them. Families keep the bodies of dead relatives in unheated flats, frozen naturally, as emergency food reserves. Cannibalism becomes so common that special police units are formed to pursue those who kill for human flesh. The only supply route is across Lake Ladoga. In winter, when the lake freezes over, a route known as the Road of Life is established across the ice. Lorries transport minimal supplies into the city and evacuate civilians to the east. But the ice is treacherous, and the German bombing is constant. Hundreds of lorries sink through the ice with their drivers. Drivers learn to drive with the doors open, ready to jump out if the ice breaks beneath their wheels. 1 million civilians die in Leningrad during the siege. That is more than all British and American military casualties combined throughout the war. But the city never surrenders. Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony, composed during the siege, is performed in the besieged city with the orchestra so weakened by hunger that some musicians collapse during the performance. It is an act of cultural defiance, an affirmation that the human spirit can survive even when the body is dying. In the territories occupied by Germany, another war is being waged in parallel, the resistance. In France, resistance groups sabotage railways, pass on intelligence to London, and hide downed Allied pilots. They are ordinary men and women who risk torture and summary execution. Is greater than German rep. Risals are brutal. For every German soldier killed by the resistance, the Nazis execute 50 civilian hostages. In Oradour-sur-Glane, in 1944, the SS massacred the entire population of the village. 642 people, including children, in retaliation for resistance activity in the area. In Warsaw, the history of the resistance is particularly tragic. In April 1943, when the Nazis decided to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto and deport its remaining inhabitants to Treblinka to be gassed, the Jews of the ghetto rebelled. With improvised weapons, smuggled pistols, Molotov cocktails. They fought against the SS. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted 27 days, far longer than anyone had expected. The Jewish fighters know they cannot win, that they are merely choosing how to die. But they prefer to die fighting than in gas chambers. The SS burned the ghetto building by building, throwing grenades into underground bunkers, using flamethrowers against fortified positions. When it is over, 13,000 Jews have died in the battle, and the 56,000 survivors are sent to extermination camps. The SS commander, Jürgen Stroop, writes a report which he proudly titles "The Warsaw Jewish Ghetto No Longer Exists." The photographs in his report show children with their hands raised, women being led away at gunpoint, buildings in flames. These are images that will haunt humanity. A year later, in August 1944, Warsaw rises up again. The Polish Home Army, hoping that the approaching Red Army will liberate the city, launches a general uprising against the German occupation. 63 days of urban warfare devastate what remains of Warsaw. But the Soviets, who have reached the Vistula River on the other side of the city, halt their advance. Stalin deliberately allows the Germans to massacre the non-communist Polish resistance, eliminating future obstacles to Soviet domination of Poland. When the uprising finally surrenders in October, 200,000 Polish civilians have died. Hitler, enraged by the resistance, orders Warsaw to be completely destroyed. Special demolition units spend the following months systematically blowing up every remaining building. When the Soviets finally enter Warsaw in January 1945, they find a ghost town, 85% of its buildings destroyed, a necropolis of rubble. Whilst Europe bleeds, a war of a different nature, but equally brutal, unfolds in Asia. The Japanese occupation of China, which began in 1937 with the invasion of Manchuria, is characterized by atrocities rivaling anything perpetrated by the Nazis. In Nanking, in December 1937, Japanese troops massacred between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians over a period of 6 weeks. Japanese soldiers held decapitation contests, carried out mass rapes of women of all ages, used babies for bayonet practice. Japanese officers regarded the Chinese as subhuman, unworthy of the protections of the Geneva Conventions. Unit 731 of the Japanese Army, stationed in Manchuria, carried out medical experiments on prisoners that were so horrific that when the information finally emerged after the war, many refused to believe it. Led by General Shiro Ishii, the unit deliberately infects prisoners with the plague, anthrax, and cholera to study the progression of diseases. They perform vivisections without anesthesia. They freeze prisoners' limbs and then thaw them to study gangrene. Is greater than they test grenades and flamethrowers on live prisoners tied to stakes. At least 3,000 people die in these experiments. After the war, the United States grants immunity to the scientists of Unit 731 Inches exchange for their research data. One of the most morally repugnant post-war agreements. The Burma campaign is one of the least known but most brutal in the Asian theater. British, Indian and Chinese troops fight the Japanese in jungles where tropical diseases kill as many men as combat. Malaria, dysentery, and typhus are constant enemies. The wounded often cannot be evacuated from jungle positions and die of infections. Soldiers learn to distinguish the sounds of different nocturnal animals to tell whether a noise in the darkness is a tiger or a Japanese soldier. The Japanese force allied prisoners of war and Asian civilian laborers to build the death railway from Burma to Thailand. 415 kilometers through jungle and mountains. Working conditions are so brutal that 60,000 civilian laborers and 13,000 prisoners of war die during construction. The men work barefoot, suffering from dysentery and insect bites that become infected, under constant beatings from Japanese guards. Those too weak to work are beaten to death. When the railway is finally completed, every sleeper represents the death of a man. In the pack, Ifik, the island hopping campaign produces battles of particular intensity. On Peleliu, in September 1944, US Marines face Japanese defenses in coral caves. The island is small, only 13 square kilometers, but it is fortified with bunkers interconnected by tunnels. The Japanese can vanish into the tunnels and reappear behind American lines. The battle, expected to last 4 days, drags on for 2 months. The tropical heat, combined with constant combat, results in casualty rates from heat exhaustion almost as high as those from enemy fire. The kamikaze, the Japanese suicide pilots, appear for the first time in the Philippines in October 1944. Young pilots, many barely trained to fly, crash their planes, laden with explosives, into American ships. It is a tactic of desperation, a tacit acknowledgement that Japan cannot win a conventional war. But it is terrifyingly effective. The kamikazes damage hundreds of ships and sink dozens. American sailors develop a particular dread of these attacks, because there is no way to deter a pilot determined to die. The Battle of Manila in February 1945 is one of the most destructive of the Pacific War. The Japanese, in violation of the Declaration of Manila as an open city, entrenched themselves in the city. A month of urban combat devastates what was once the Pearl of the Orient. The Japanese committed mass atrocities against Filipino civilians, massacring 100,000 inches, what is known as the Manila Massacre. When the city was finally liberated, it was so devastated that only Warsaw suffered greater damage among Allied cities. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Soviet offensive, launched in mid-1944, advances like an unstoppable avalanche. Operation Bagration, launched on 22 June 1944, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa, is greater than destroyed the German Army Group Center. It was the greatest defeat the Wehrmacht had ever suffered, worse than Stalingrad. 28 German divisions were annihilated. 350,000 soldiers killed or captured. Belarus was liberated in 5 weeks. The Soviets advance in multiple directions. In the north, they liberate the Baltic states. In the south, they cross Romania and Bulgaria, forcing them to switch sides. In Poland, they liberate the Majdanek extermination camp in July, the first to be captured intact. The gas chambers still contain the crystals of Zyklon B used for murder. The crematoria still hold human ashes. For the first time, there is irrefutable physical evidence of the industrial scale of the Nazi genocide. The liberation of the concentration camps by Western troops in the spring of 1945 confronted Allied soldiers with horrors for which they were unprepared. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British in April, they found 10,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 prisoners in such an advanced state of starvation that 13,000 would die in the weeks that followed, despite medical care. Typhus was so widespread that the entire camp had to be burned down after the survivors had been evacuated. At Buchenwald, liberated by the Americans, soldiers found lamps made from tattooed human skin, human heads shrunken as curiosities, evidence of medical experiments. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, orders German citizens from the nearby town to be forced to tour the camp and bury the dead. He wants them to see what their government did. He orders everything to be extensively photographed and filmed because, he says, the day will come when there will be those who deny that this happened. The particular cruelty of the Nazi camp system lies in its bureaucracy. Prisoners have numbers tattooed on them. Meticulous records are kept of arrivals and deaths. The victims' belongings are sorted and sent to Germany, hair to make fabric, gold teeth to be melted down, shoes to be recycled. It is industrial genocide, mass death carried out with factory-like efficiency. Camp commanders are often ordinary men with families who go home after work to play with their children, having spent the day overseeing mass murders. Rudolf Höss, Commandant of Auschwitz, oversees the deaths of over 1 million people. In his memoirs, written whilst awaiting execution after the war, he describes his work in the clinical language of a manager discussing production. The problem of disposing of the bodies, the efficiency of different gas chamber designs, the logistics of managing transports of thousands of people. He expresses no remorse, only technical frustration with the challenges of murder on an industrial scale. The Jewish ghettos established by the Nazis in Eastern Europe are intermediate stages in the process of extermination. In the Warsaw Ghetto, 500,000 Jews are crammed into an area of 3 square kilometers. Food rations are deliberately insufficient to sustain life. 5,000 people die of starvation every month. Corpses lie in the streets because there is no capacity to bury them. Children smuggle food through the ghetto walls, risking being shot by German guards. The Nazis systematically document their crimes by producing propaganda films that portray the Jews in the ghetto as subhumans living voluntarily in filth. These films, intended to justify the extermination, are of a cynicism that defies comprehension. They force wealthy Jews to dine lavishly whilst others starve to death on the very same street, filming it as evidence of Jewish selfishness. It is propaganda so grotesque that even some Nazis find it excessive. The death marches in the final months of the war added a final atrocity. As the Allies advanced, the Nazis evacuated concentration camps, forcing emaciated prisoners to march hundreds of kilometers in the depths of winter without food or adequate shelter. Those who collapse are shot where they fall. Of the 70,000 prisoners evacuated from Auschwitz in January 1945, 15,000 die on the marches. The Nazis are destroying evidence, killing witnesses, but they are also perpetuating their cruelty until the very last possible moment. On the Western Front, after crossing the Rhine in March 1945, Allied forces advance rapidly towards the heart of Germany. German resistance collapses. Entire divisions surrender without a fight. German soldiers, especially on the Western Front, prefer to surrender to the Americans or British rather than to the Soviets. They know the treatment will be different. The Soviets have little mercy for an enemy that destroyed their cities and killed 20 million of their people. When Soviet troops enter Germany, the reprisals are brutal. Soviet soldiers carry out mass rapes of German women, ranging from girls to elderly women. In Berlin alone, it is estimated that 100,000 women are raped, many of them multiple times. It is revenge for what the Germans did in Russia, but the victims are innocent civilians. This violence will be hushed up for decades, a shameful secret for both perpetrators and victims. The final battle for Berlin destroys what remains of the city. The Soviets are in no hurry. They use heavy artillery to reduce the city building by building before advancing. The Germans defend with suicidal fanaticism. 14-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth, in uniforms that are too big, hold Panzerfausts with trembling hands. Old men in First World War uniforms pull rifles from museums. It is the apocalyptic end that Hitler prophesied. Germany burning rather than surrender. In the bunker beneath the Chancellery, Hitler spends his final weeks in a delirium of denial and rage. He marries Eva Braun in a pathetic ceremony. He dictates his political testament, blaming the Jews, the generals, everyone except himself. He orders the execution of Hermann Fegelein, Eva Braun's brother-in-law, for attempting to flee Berlin. When he learns that Himmler has attempted to negotiate a separate surrender with the Western Allies, his rage is incoherent. On 30 April, with Soviet soldiers just blocks away from the bunker, Hitler bids farewell to his staff. Eva Braun takes cyanide. Hitler shoots himself in the temple. Their bodies are taken to the garden, doused in petrol and set alight. But the fire is interrupted by Soviet artillery bombardment. The partially burned remains are hastily buried. The Soviets will find them days later. They will confirm their identities through dental records, and then keep the discovery secret for decades, fueling conspiracy theories about Hitler's survival. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister, and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children in the bunker the night after Hitler's death. The children are aged between 4 and 12. The parents then commit suicide. It is a fitting end for a regime that promoted death over life, that preferred to destroy Germany rather than accept defeat. Germany's surrender on 8 May brings no immediate relief. Millions of refugees flood the roads of Europe. Germans fleeing from the east. Camps for displaced persons filled with concentration camp survivors. Freed prisoners of war. Forced laborers. It is the largest population movement in European history, 12 million Germans are expelled from Eastern Europe, many dying in the process. The discovery of the full scale of the Holocaust confronts the world with an evil that defies comprehension. 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the European Jewish population, have been murdered. Communities that had existed for a millennium have been wiped out. In Poland, which had 3 million Jews before the war, only 300,000 survive. Entire villages where everyone spoke Yiddish are now empty or inhabited by others. Holocaust survivors face a world that does not want them. Many have no homes to return to. Their property has been confiscated, their communities destroyed. Some who attempt to return to their villages in Poland are murdered by neighbors who have taken over their property. Camps for displaced persons fill up with Jews who have nowhere to go. Britain, which controls Palestine, severely restricts Jewish immigration by intercepting refugee ships and sending them back. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima created a whole new kind of horror. It is not just the number of immediate deaths, 70,000, but what comes afterwards. The radiation causes leukemia, cancer, and by birth defects in future generations is greater than the survivors, known as hibakusha, bear keloid scars where their skin was burnt, and many face social discrimination because others fear the radiation is contagious. Yoshito Matsushige, one of the few photographers in Hiroshima on the day of the bombing, describes people walking like zombies with skin hanging from their arms, mothers carrying dead babies without realizing they are dead, a ghostly silence over the city, except for occasional moans. The river is filled with the bodies of people who threw themselves into the water seeking relief from their burns. The shadows of people instantly vaporized are permanently etched onto the stone walls, a chilling phenomenon caused by the photographic exposure to the light of the atomic flash. The debate over whether it was necessary to use atomic weapons continues to this day. Proponents argue that it saved millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion of mainland Japan. Critics point out that Japan was already defeated, and that the naval blockade and conventional bombing would have forced surrender without the need for atomic weapons. Some argue that the bombs were dropped more to impress the Soviets than to defeat Japan. What is indisputable is that the atomic bombs ushered in a new era. For the first time, humanity possessed the power to completely destroy itself. The Cold War nuclear arms race that followed would produce arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over. The Second World War not only killed 80 million people, but also created the possibility of future wars that could kill billions. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials set important legal precedents. For the first time, leaders were tried for crimes against humanity, a legal concept devised to address unprecedented atrocities. The defendants argued that they were merely following orders, that they were acting on behalf of sovereign states, that the victors had no right to judge the vanquished. But the tribunal rejected these defenses. It held that there are laws superior to national laws, moral principles that no state may violate. 12 Nazi leaders are sentenced to death at Nuremberg. Hermann Goering, Hitler's second-in-command, commits suicide with cyanide hours before his scheduled execution. The others are hanged on 16 October 1946. Julius Streicher, editor of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, shouts Heil Hitler before the trapdoor falls. The bodies are cremated and the ashes scattered in a river so that there are no places of pilgrimage for future Nazis. But many perpetrators escape justice. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the logistics of the Holocaust, flees to Argentina, where he lives quietly until Israeli agents abduct him in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who carried out grotesque medical experiments on prisoners, also flees to South America and is never captured, dying by drowning in Brazil in 1979. Thousands of lesser-known Nazis disappear, end to the general population, many securing respectable positions in post-war Germany. The reconstruction of Europe takes decades. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, injects $13 billion in US aid into Western Europe. It is partly humanitarian, partly strategic. The United States wants to prevent communism from spreading to impoverished and desperate societies. The aid works. By the 1950s, Western Europe is on the road to economic recovery. But Eastern Europe, under Soviet control, receives no Marshall aid and will remain impoverished for decades. The division of Europe into East and West, capitalist and communist, democratic and totalitarian, solidifies with surprising speed. In March 1946, Churchill delivers his famous speech on the Iron Curtain that has descended upon Europe. In 1948, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in an attempt to expel the Western Allies. The Berlin Airlift, in which Allied aircraft delivered supplies for 318 days, thwarted the blockade and became the first confrontation of the Cold War. European colonies in Asia and Africa begin to demand independence. The war has shown that Europeans are not invincible. Japan defeated the British, French, and Dutch empires in a matter of months. Nationalist movements that were suppressed before the war are now unstoppable. India gains independence from Britain in 1947. Indonesia from the Netherlands. Vietnam and Indochina launch wars of independence against France that will last for decades. The colonial order that dominated the world for centuries collapses within a generation. The Second World War fundamentally alters global power structures. Britain, though victorious, is exhausted and impoverished. France is divided and humiliated. Germany is occupied and divided. Only the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as superpowers. But it is a Pyrrhic victory for the USSR. 20 million Soviets have died. Entire cities lie in ruins. The economy is devastated. Stalin responds with renewed repression, sending to labor camps not only actual collaborators, but also Soviet prisoners of war returning from Germany, suspected of ideological contamination due to their exposure to the West. The war also brings profound social changes. Women who worked in arms factories, who served in military auxiliary services, who managed the domestic economy in the absence of men, are not willing to simply return to traditional roles. The feminist movement of the following decades has its roots in this transformation. Returning soldiers, having seen the world, having faced death and destruction, are unwilling to accept the rigid social hierarchies of the pre-war era. Technology developed during the war transformed civilian life. Radar became the basis of air traffic control. Penicillin, mass-produced to treat war wounds, revolutionized medicine. Computers, developed to decipher codes and calculate projectile trajectories, LVE, into the machines that will transform society. German V-2 rockets form the basis of the American and Soviet space programs. Werner von Braun, designer of the V-2S that killed thousands of civilians in London, is taken to the United States, where he will design the rockets that will put humans on the moon. The Geneva Convention is expanded after the war to include additional protections for civilians and prisoners. The United Nations is founded in the hope of preventing future global conflicts. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, establishes for the first time in history that all humans have inalienable rights that no government may violate. These are noble attempts to build a better world upon the ruins of the old. But history shows that the lessons of war are forgotten with each new generation. The survivors, those who lived through the horror, never forget. They have numbers tattooed on them, shrapnel scars, nightmares that never end. But as they die, the visceral knowledge of how terrible the war was fades away. War begins to be romanticized, reduced to films of heroes and villains, stripped of its reality of mass human suffering. Monuments built after the war seek to preserve the memory. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the American cemeteries in Normandy, the Soviet monuments in Stalingrad and Berlin. Each represents an attempt to ensure we do not forget. But stone monuments cannot convey the lived experience of hiding in a cellar while your city is bombed, of seeing your family deported to extermination camps, of charging against machine gun nests knowing you will probably die. Surviving veterans often do not speak of their experiences. The trauma is too deep, the horrors too great for words. Only in their final years, as death approaches, do some finally begin to tell their stories. Oral history records capture the testimonies of the last survivors. Holocaust museums preserve testimonies on video. There is a race against time to document living testimony before all those who were there pass away. The Second World War was the defining event of the 20th century. More than anything else, it shaped the world in which we live today. National borders, international alliances, attitudes towards human rights and genocide, the technology we use, everything bears the mark of this war. And perhaps most importantly, it left us with the question that every generation must answer. Could it happen again? Is humanity capable of such barbarity again? The uncomfortable answer, suggested by subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, is that yes, it can. The capacity for evil on a massive scale did not die with Hitler. It remains latent, waiting for conditions and leaders that might unleash it once more. That is why remembering is not just about honoring the dead, but protecting the living and future generations from the horror of history repeating itself.
Release the tension in your forehead. Relax the muscles around your eyes. Let your arms rest completely, heavy and warm at either side of your body. Your breath now flows naturally, like gentle waves lapping at the shore and receding effortlessly. The stories you have heard tonight slowly fade away, becoming distant whispers that you no longer need to follow. If this journey through time has served you well, you can support this space by liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. That way, more people seeking rest may find refuge here. And if you are still awake, there is another story waiting in silence, ready to guide you deeper into sleep. But for now, let the voices of the past fade gently away. Let the names, Dates and events melt into the mist of the night's oblivion. The story can wait until tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let go of everything. Rest deeply, and may you have sweet dreams.